As the cameras dim and the familiar studio lights soften, the departure of Gayle King from CBS News marks more than professional transition. It signals the end of a defining era in modern broadcast journalism, one shaped by composure under pressure, emotional intelligence in moments of national grief, and a rare ability to balance journalistic rigor with unmistakable humanity. For years, she stood not merely as an anchor reading from a teleprompter, but as a trusted presence in living rooms across the country, guiding viewers through tragedies, triumphs, scandals, cultural shifts, and deeply personal human stories with a steadiness that felt almost protective. And if her goodbye follows tragedy, whether personal or institutional, it reminds the world that even the strongest public figures are not immune to the weight of private sorrow. Behind the polished professionalism was a woman who carried the emotional gravity of every breaking story, who asked hard questions without cruelty, who held silence in interviews long enough for truth to surface, and who understood that journalism at its best is not about spectacle but about clarity, accountability, and compassion. Colleagues often described her as both relentless and empathetic, someone who could challenge presidents and comfort grieving families in the same broadcast, a duality that defined a career and elevated her beyond the typical confines of morning television. Her presence during national crises became synonymous with calm, and in an age of viral outrage and fractured media landscapes, she represented something increasingly rare: measured credibility. Viewers did not simply watch her, they trusted her, and trust in journalism is a currency more fragile than ratings or contracts. If this farewell is born from tragedy, it carries the added resonance of vulnerability, because stepping away from such a visible platform requires both courage and introspection, especially for someone whose identity has long been intertwined with the rhythm of live television. Over the years, she navigated controversies, high-profile interviews, and public scrutiny with a composure that suggested resilience was not merely a trait but a discipline, cultivated through decades in the industry. She understood that journalism demands sacrifice, long hours, emotional labor, constant exposure to the world's darkest headlines, and perhaps that weight, accumulated over time, can quietly reshape priorities, reminding even the most dedicated professionals that personal well-being and healing cannot be indefinitely postponed. Her goodbye, therefore, is not just a career milestone, but an emotional moment for viewers who grew accustomed to her voice marking the start of their day, and for colleagues who relied on her leadership during chaotic breaking news cycles. It is a closing of a chapter defined by authenticity in a profession often criticized for performance. And regardless of what tragedy precipitated this decision, the impact of her absence will be felt not only in studio ratings but in the subtle space where reassurance once lived, because some anchors deliver news, while others become part of the audience's emotional landscape. And Gayle King undeniably became the latter dot, and as the reality of her departure settles in, the significance of Gayle King stepping away from CBS News becomes even more profound. Because her role was never confined to reading headlines, it was about shaping the tone of national conversation, about asking the question that others hesitated to voice, about holding silence long enough for authenticity to surface in interviews that might otherwise have dissolved into rehearsed talking points. Throughout her tenure, she cultivated a reputation for emotional intelligence that transcended the mechanics of journalism, demonstrating that firmness and compassion are not opposites but complements, and that accountability delivered with respect often yields more truth than aggression ever could. Viewers witness and navigate moments of collective grief, mass tragedies, cultural reckonings, political unrest, with a steadiness that felt almost grounding, as though her calm presence alone could steady the chaos unfolding beyond the screen. And that consistency forged a bond between anchor and audience that is increasingly rare in an era defined by media fragmentation and fleeting attention. If tragedy indeed lies at the heart of her farewell, it underscores the hidden toll exacted by years spent absorbing the world's pain, because journalism at that level is not a passive profession. It requires absorbing stories of loss, injustice, heartbreak, and uncertainty day after day, carrying them internally while projecting composure externally, a balance that demands extraordinary resilience. Colleagues have often described her as the emotional compass of the newsroom, someone who insisted on nuance when narratives grew polarized, who valued preparation as a form of respect for both subject and audience, and who understood that credibility is built not in grand gestures but in daily consistency. Her interviews became defining cultural moments not because they were sensational, but because they were sincere. She listened actively, challenged strategically, and allowed humanity to coexist with scrutiny, a rare equilibrium that elevated conversations beyond confrontation. The thought of her absence inevitably raises questions about continuity and legacy, about who will inherit not just a chair but the quiet authority she carried into every broadcast. And while news organizations evolve, personalities shift, and programming adapts, certain presences leave imprints that linger long after the cameras pivot elsewhere. Perhaps what makes this goodbye resonate so deeply is a recognition that public figures, no matter how composed, are also individuals navigating private realities unseen by millions, and stepping away, especially under tragic circumstances, can be an act of preservation rather than retreat, a decision rooted not in defeat but in self-awareness. In that sense, her farewell becomes not merely an ending but a powerful statement about boundaries, about acknowledging that strength includes knowing when to pause, when to heal, when to choose personal restoration over perpetual performance. And as audiences reflect on the years she spent guiding them through uncertainty, it becomes clear that her true impact cannot be measured solely in ratings or headlines, but in the trust she cultivated, the conversations she elevated, and the standard of integrity she embodied, leaving behind not just an empty seat at a news desk, but a legacy defined by clarity, courage, and compassion in a world that often demands all three at once. And yet what makes this moment even heavier is the realization that Gayle King was never simply a fixture of CBS News. She became a symbol of steadiness in an age when certainty often feels out of reach, a journalist whose presence suggested that no matter how turbulent the headlines, there would be clarity, context, and composure waiting on the other side of the commercial break. Over the years, she mastered the delicate balance between authority and approachability, proving that toughness in questioning does not require harshness in tone, and that empathy does not weaken credibility but strengthens it. And in doing so, she redefined what a modern news anchor could be: firm yet fair, inquisitive yet humane, unshaken yet emotionally aware. If tragedy has indeed shaped this goodbye, it adds a layer of poignancy that resonates far beyond the newsroom, because audiences rarely consider the emotional accumulation carried by those who report on heartbreak daily, the quiet toll of narrating loss after loss while maintaining professional poise, the invisible weight of absorbing grief that does not belong to you yet still leaves an imprint. Her departure invites reflection not only on her career but on the broader human cost of constant exposure to crisis, reminding viewers that behind the steady gaze and measured cadence was a person navigating life's own uncertainties. Colleagues often credited her with setting the emotional temperature of the broadcast, insisting on preparation, integrity, and a commitment to truth even when stories became politically charged or culturally divisive. And that insistence created a newsroom culture where accountability was not optional but expected. She brought depth to interviews that might otherwise have remained superficial, asking follow-up questions that pierced rehearsed narratives and revealed layers beneath public statements. And those moments, often subtle, sometimes explosive, cemented her reputation as more than presenter but as a journalist deeply invested in substance over spectacle. As she steps away, the absence feels less like a personnel change and more like the closing of a chapter in which viewers found not only information but reassurance, not only updates but understanding. And in that space between headline and human reaction, she carved out something rare: trust. Her goodbye, therefore, carries an emotional resonance that transcends logistics, suggesting that sometimes the most powerful legacy a journalist leaves behind is not a single interview or broadcast, but the cumulative sense of reliability, compassion, and strength that made millions feel informed without feeling overwhelmed, guided without feeling manipulated, and seen in moments when the world felt uncertain. And as the days moved forward without her familiar presence anchoring the broadcast, the void left by Gayle King at CBS News becomes increasingly tangible, not because a chair sits empty, but because the intangible qualities she brought, gravitas, warmth, discernment, cannot be easily replicated. For years she cultivated a rhythm that blended urgency with restraint, ensuring that breaking news never descended into chaos and that emotional stories were handled with dignity rather than dramatization, and that discipline created a viewing experience grounded in trust rather than sensationalism. Her colleagues often described how she would prepare extensively before major interviews, studying every nuance, anticipating every deflection, not to trap her subjects but to honor the seriousness of the conversation, and that level of dedication elevated the tone of the newsroom, reminding everyone involved that journalism is both a craft and a responsibility. If tragedy has indeed shaped her departure. It underscores the fragile boundary between public service and private endurance, because those who consistently project strength are rarely granted the space to reveal vulnerability, and choosing to step away can be an act of profound self-respect rather than retreat. Over time, she became more than an anchor. She became a cultural touchstone, someone viewers associated with measured clarity in moments of confusion, someone whose facial expressions alone could communicate empathy during heartbreaking reports or firmness during evasive answers. Her departure also prompts reflection on the evolving landscape of media itself, where speed often outpaces substance and commentary frequently overshadows reporting, yet she remained committed to asking thoughtful questions and allowing conversation to unfold organically, resisting the pressure to turn every exchange into spectacle. What lingers now is not simply nostalgia but recognition, the understanding that consistent integrity builds a legacy far stronger than viral moments, and that the quiet authority she carried into each broadcast was earned through years of discipline, resilience, and emotional intelligence. As audiences adjust to a new chapter, they may come to realize that her impact extended beyond individual stories. It shaped the way many experienced the news itself, transforming from a barrage of information into something steadier, more contextual, more human. And in that transformation lies the true measure of her contribution, a reminder that journalism at its best does not merely inform but anchors, steadies, and connects, even as the faces behind the desk inevitably change in the wake of her departure. Conversations inside and outside the newsroom continue to circle back to what truly made Gayle King indispensable at CBS News, because her influence was never loud or self-congratulatory. It was steady, deliberate, and deeply rooted in preparation and principle. She possessed a rare instinct for timing, knowing when to press harder in an interview and when to step back and let emotion breathe. And that instinct cannot be taught easily, as it is forged through decades of experience, self-awareness, and an unwavering respect for the audience. Producers often relied on her not just to deliver lines, but to interpret tone, to sense when a segment needed gravity rather than speed, empathy rather than urgency, and that subtle leadership shaped broadcast in ways viewers may never consciously notice yet undeniably feel. If tragedy has influenced a decision to say goodbye, it casts a career in an even more human light, reminding the public that those who guide us through the world's pain are not immune to carrying their own, and that resilience, no matter how practiced, has limits that must be honored. She stood firm during politically charged eras, navigated controversial interviews with composure, and refused to let sensationalism dictate her approach, choosing instead to prioritize clarity over chaos, substance over spectacle, and accountability over theatrics. In doing so, she earned a loyalty from viewers that transcended habit. People did not merely tune in out of routine. They tuned in because her presence signaled reliability, a sense that whatever the story, it would be handled with seriousness and care. As tributes and reflections emerge, many highlight not just her on-air accomplishments, but her mentorship behind the scenes, her encouragement of younger journalists, her insistence on high standards balanced with compassion, and those quieter contributions may ultimately form the backbone of her legacy. Stepping away under tragic circumstances, if that is indeed the case, does not diminish that legacy. It deepens it, adding dimension to the narrative of a woman who gave years of emotional labor to a profession that demands constant vigilance. And perhaps what lingers most profoundly is a recognition that her goodbye is not merely about absence, but about impact, the kind that reshapes expectations, elevates standards, and leaves behind a blueprint for integrity in a media landscape that often struggles to hold on to it. And as the industry reflects on what her absence truly signifies, it becomes clear that Gayle King did more than occupy a prominent seat at CBS News. She quietly reshaped what audiences expect from those who deliver the news, proving that authority does not require arrogance and that empathy does not weaken journalistic strength. She carried herself with composure that felt earned rather than performed. And in moments of national trauma, her steady cadence became a kind of emotional metronome, guiding viewers through uncertainty without amplifying fear. When interviews turned tense, she remained unshaken, allowing silence to do its work, understanding that patience often reveals more than confrontation, and that disciplined restraint can be more powerful than raised voices. If tragedy stands behind her farewell, it casts a departure not as retreat but as testament to the fact that even the strongest professionals must sometimes prioritize healing over visibility, humanity over habit. Over the years, she navigated the shifting terrain of modern media, where speed often eclipses depth and opinion competes with reporting. Yet she resisted the pull toward sensationalism, anchoring conversations in fact, context, and thoughtful inquiry. Colleagues have spoken about the rigor she brought to preparation, the hours spent refining questions, the commitment to fairness even when facing polarizing figures, and that diligence translated into broadcasts that felt grounded rather than reactive. Viewers, whether consciously or not, came to associate her presence with a certain emotional safety, a sense that the day's chaos would be filtered through steadiness and discernment. And now, as she steps away, that safety feels altered, not erased but transformed into legacy, because what she leaves behind is more than archived interviews or milestone moments. It is a standard, a reminder that journalism at its best is not about dominating the narrative but about stewarding it responsibly, not about spectacle but about substance. And in that quiet yet enduring influence lies a true measure of her impact, one that will continue to echo long after the studio lights have shifted to another face behind the desk. And as this chapter closes, the resonance of Gayle King stepping away from CBS News continues to deepen, because her career was never defined by a single headline but by the accumulation of steady mornings, difficult conversations, and moments when the nation looked to her not just for updates, but for understanding. She cultivated an atmosphere where seriousness did not eclipse compassion, where accountability coexisted with dignity, and where viewers felt neither talked down to nor emotionally manipulated. And that balance is rarer than it appears. In an era when trust in institutions has eroded and the media landscape has grown louder and more fragmented, she remained anchored in preparation, perspective, and poise, demonstrating that credibility is not built through viral moments but through consistency. If tragedy has influenced her decision to say goodbye, it serves as a poignant reminder that those who report on the world's upheaval are not insulated from their own, and that sometimes the strongest act is choosing space over spotlight. Her interviews often lingered in public memory not because they were explosive, but because they were revealing. She asked what needed to be asked without theatrics, listened without interruption, and allowed complexity to surface rather than forcing simplicity. For the sake of speed, that discipline shaped not only the broadcast but the broader cultural conversation, reinforcing the idea that journalism can inform without inflaming, challenge without humiliating, and probe without exploiting. As new faces inevitably step into familiar roles, they will inherit a framework she helped solidify, a standard of measured authority and human-centered reporting that audiences have come to expect. And perhaps the most enduring element of her farewell is the quiet recognition that while studios evolve and programming shifts, the essence of what made her presence powerful, integrity, emotional intelligence, and unwavering professionalism, cannot simply be replaced, only respected and, if possible, emulated, ensuring that her influence persists not as nostalgia, but as a benchmark for what broadcast journalism can aspire to be. And even as the broadcast moves forward and the familiar cadence of morning news continues without pause, the absence of Gayle King at CBS News feels like the quiet removal of a